Tobias A. Bradford has been in Moscow since August of 2004 and is responsible for all programs dealing with professional development, including the International Visitor Program, Community Connections, and Business for Russia, productivity enhancement, professional education and training, outreach to think tanks and the intellectual community, the U.S.-Russian Experts Forum, and the U.S.-Russia Volunteer Initiative. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, he spent several years in the private sector in training and development. He's lived in Egypt, Germany, Jordan, Pakistan, France, Russia, El Salvador, and South Africa, and loves to travel with his wife Nikki and daughter Madison. Bradford completed a BA in Russian and Communication Studies and an MOB at Brigham Young University, as well as coursework for a master's program in international development at the Kennedy Center. He served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Russia from 1992 to 1994. I may note that recently he sponsored, I believe it was the U.S.-Russia Experts Forum or the Outreach Volunteer Initiative?
Which one?
The one in May.
Oh, that was part of the IB program, actually.
IB program. He's constantly sponsoring events and outreach, bringing together academia, journalists, NGOs, and building bridges for the United States as well as higher education. We're very grateful to have Mr. Bradford here, and please join me in welcoming Tobias Bradford.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for that nice introduction. My wife, Nikki, is sitting here in the front row, and we've been back now since late Saturday night. This is our first time back in Utah in several years, and I can't tell you how nice it is to be back, to have an opening prayer. That's not typically what we do at the beginning of a speech where we live right now, and it just feels refreshing to be back here. We think often about the influence that our BYU education had on us and try and pass it along as we have a chance to travel and experience other cultures. And the remarkable thing is how often we see BYU grads out, whether it's before we moved overseas or in our overseas work, and some of the great things that they do. And I must say that I've worked side by side with graduates from Harvard and from Stanford and from Wharton and a variety of schools, and I count the BYU folks that I work with now and have worked with as some of the best and brightest. So I think, first of all, you have a bright future in front of you. As Corey mentioned, right now we are assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. I am in the Public Affairs section, and my title is Second Secretary for Public Affairs, which I'm sure sounds a lot more important than it actually is. But essentially what I do is I try and engage the intellectual and analytical communities, those who think and do research about public policy issues, and try and help them get more connected with their U.S. counterparts. And I think one thing that you'll see over the course of my remarks today is that we face a pretty large disconnect, especially in the policy arena, between our approach and philosophy and that which we see most commonly in Russia. And so I see kind of my job as finding a way to bridge that gap and getting communication going both ways so that we can at least be speaking the same language and understanding one another when it comes to policy and governance. Whether or not we agree with each other is a different question, but that those lines of communication are open. One thing I will say about Moscow is that life is never boring there. Moscow has a lot of strategic importance for us, not just because of our historic relations with the Soviet Union, but for a variety of other reasons. Everybody wants to come to Russia. In the last 6 months or so, I've had a part in visits from Secretary Rice twice, President and Mrs. Bush, former President Bush, multiple congressmen and other senior government officials, players and coaches from the NBA. We sponsored a clinic for Russian American youth with some NBA coaches. The National Figure Skating Team, the U.S. Tennis Association, Andrei Kirilenko from the Jazz is coming a little bit later on this summer. The Spurs are coming in the fall. So, overall, it represents a lot of work, but it's also a heck of a lot of fun. And so we overall are very pleased with our chance to be in Russia. What I want to share with you today are some perspectives, mostly on the current state of U.S.-Russian relations. I want to share with you some historical developments in the economic and political arenas, and then maybe to close up, try and share some perspectives on what we feel the key issues that will frame the way U.S.-Russian relations will look over the next 5 or 10 years. What those key issues are and how we should approach them. First of all, I know that a lot of you have a lot of background in these areas, and I hope not to bore you with maybe some of the fundamental details and get some chance for question and answers at the end. Also, please interpret my remarks as my own opinion, my own position. I'm not Richard Boucher. I'm not an official spokesperson for the State Department at this point, but I hope I'll be able to answer some of your questions. I want to start with an image that struck me a few months ago. After President Bush's re-election, he and President Putin met in their first summit after the re-election in Bratislava. And many interesting things happened, one of which I think really illustrates the current state of U.S.-Russian relations. I'm sure you've covered it in the news that President Bush has made democracy in Russia a key part of his agenda. And anytime we get official communication about Russia, the lack of development in the sphere of democracy is one of the key items that we see there. And so President Bush was kind of lightly pressing President Putin about some of these less than positive political developments. Specifically, he was referring to freedom of the press and what we see as more regulation of the press on the part of the Putin administration. And immediately, President Putin turned back to him and said, well, if the press is so free in the U.S., then why did Dan Rather get fired from CBS? And I wasn't sitting there watching it, but I heard a firsthand account that President Bush and the other members of his delegation looked back at President Putin, wondering what he was referring to and wondering if he was really serious. Why would his real question was, why would the White House then arrange for Dan Rather and those other pesky CBS reporters to lose their jobs for a perhaps less than stellar set of research on the National Guard story that had aired a few months earlier? And you can imagine that as we realized that they were serious, they really thought that President Bush had worked with CBS to get Dan Rather fired because of the fact that the story was negative about him. And to try and convince President Putin that we had nothing to do with that was an internal CBS affair. They decided to do that on the grounds of journalistic integrity and ethical standards rather than anything else. But the fact that in our society, it's inconceivable and unthinkable that this type of thing would happen, and yet in Russian society, it's an everyday occurrence, to me was an illustration of the fact that even though we may be using the same words, talking about press freedom, talking about independence, etc., the way we approach the topics are vastly different. And the gap in the way that we look at governance, the way we look at how governments should operate, what types of things they should be doing, it suggests that even though we've come a long way in our relations with Russia, that at this point we still have a relationship that's built more on common interests rather than common values. And this is an important distinction that I want to start with because of the fact that those of you who have studied kind of the theory of international relations know that over time, as any two sovereign countries experience disagreements over any given policy, those countries that have a relationship that's based on common values and a multi-layered set of relationships, government to government, people to people, business to business, culture to culture, etc., are much more likely to weather the storms of policy disagreements than those who do not have that fundamental foundation. And our perception is that we still have a lot of room to grow in the area of having a relationship based on common values. In fact, not too long ago, the defense minister, Sergei Ivanov, he described our relationship by saying that we are allies, but we're not yet really friends. And unfortunately, I think that is definitely the case at this point. Now let me share with you some key snapshots and indicators about Russia's economy and Russia's political system that hopefully will frame the context of some of my remarks about the challenges that we're facing. First of all, let me start with some good news. If you look at Russia's economy, this is an area that has really shown over the last about 5 years. For example, in 2004, GDP growth was 7.1%, which is remarkable. Most countries in the world would die to have 7.1% GDP growth in a given year. Industrial output increased steadily. There was increased domestic investment, and there was an upturn in private consumption. More and more Russians are having disposable income available to them to buy things like computers and, more than just bread and cabbage and potatoes and things that I got the chance to eat a lot on my mission. There are a lot of other positive macroeconomic factors. The currency is relatively stable at this point. They've had some positive developments in tax reform and administrative reform. They're starting to control inflation. The service sector is expanding, and exports are expanding. All of these things are kind of leading to much more economic stability. And the average Russian now is feeling much more like, okay, we know what's going to happen tomorrow. We can go ahead and start saving. We can start planning for the future. Something that if you asked them, for example, in the mid to late 90s, was the last thing from everybody's mind. They were all trying to survive really from day to day. The stock market in 2003, for example, grew by almost 60%, the domestic stock market. They didn't see quite as large an increase in this last year, but still, it's making Russia, I think, in the top 5 in terms of capitalization growth in all of the world markets. There's much more public confidence in the banking system, in the ruble. When I was there on my mission, everybody wanted to have dollars or some other type of hard currency, whereas now, many more Russians are keeping their savings accounts in rubles, doing their investments in rubles, etc. Real incomes are increasing rapidly. Last year, the average Russian income increased by approximately 12% in terms of spending power, which is very significant. And you can really see on the part of a lot of Russians that their confidence is starting to grow. However, balancing out, unfortunately, some of these positive developments, you see some less than positive developments as well. And one is that as the currency stabilizes and wages continue to grow, Russia is facing the need to do some serious reforms in their economic policies, domestic and foreign. And what we're also seeing is that government intervention in business is increasingly becoming the norm. And so KGB officials or former KGB officials, for example, are being appointed on the boards of very large companies. You see companies that are 51% or higher government-owned that are buying out other companies in order to build up a very large government-owned presence in the business sector. In addition, not only is this increased government control not leading to efficiency on the part of business, but it's also leading to decreased investor confidence, especially for foreign direct investment into Russia. And so as I have the chance to talk with expatriate businessmen who are in Russia, one thing that we hear all the time is, number one, the administrative structures and tax structures are making doing business in Russia extremely difficult and unprofitable. In fact, one of our neighbors, one of the members of our branch, is the CFO of Marathon Oil's Russian affiliate. And he said that they are losing money every year in Russia, mostly because of corruption and because of the tax structure. But in addition, you find fewer and fewer foreign businessmen who actually want to invest in Russia, want to start a new enterprise, want to start a joint venture, et cetera, with Russian businesses. Besides these two things, we also see a current administration that is having some extreme difficulties implementing administrative reforms. If you followed Russia in the past few months, they have kind of come to the closure of their implementation of a social benefits, a monetization of social benefits, which is essentially people who received free health care, free rides on the public transportation, free entry into a lot of facilities, museums, theaters, et cetera. The government essentially decided that rather than continuing to provide these services at no cost, they were going to provide a certain sum of money to all of these people. And it was a huge scandal in Russia. There were protests in the street at a scale that I don't think has been seen probably at least in the last 5 years. And so what we're seeing more and more now is that the Putin administration is struggling to implement some of the more, when I say liberal, I mean liberal more in the classical sense. In other words, more democratic, more free market type of reforms. And so even though the bent of the Putin administration in terms of economic policy is more democratic than we might see in the political arena, which I'm going to get to next, we do see difficulty in actually making those policies go from idea or conception to implementation. Now, as we look at the domestic political and foreign policy arena, unfortunately, there's probably a little bit less good news, because there's actually a lot of good news on the economic side. But let's talk about what's going on at home first, and then we'll turn to foreign policy for a minute. In the 1990s, after the privatization process and with some huge disagreements that occurred between the Duma and the Federation Council and President Yeltsin's government, a lot of Russians perceived the government structure and government activity as just a big mess. It was a lot of chaos. And when President Putin was appointed as President Yeltsin's successor in 1999, one of his main objectives became to bring stability to the Russian political system and to build citizen confidence in what was happening in Russia. And actually, he's done a fairly good job at that. If you use that as a key indicator, in other words, how does the average Russian feel about the way the government is functioning and how stable they are, he gets pretty high marks for that. Let me share with you a couple of quotes. In May of 2004, in his State of Union or State of the Nation address to the Federation Council, he said a couple of things that I think really give you some insights into what he feels and his administration feel are important for Russia. He said, "Now for the first time in a long time, Russia is politically and economically stable. It is also independent, both financially and in international affairs, and this is a good result in and of itself. We want high living standards and a safe, free, and comfortable life for the country. We want to strengthen Russia's place in the world. We must grow faster than the rest of the world if we want to take the lead within today's complex rules of global competition. We must be ahead of other countries in our growth rate, the quality of our goods and services, and level of our education, science, and culture. This is a question of our economic survival. It is a question of ensuring that Russia takes its deserved place in these changing international conditions." Now, if you look at this on the surface, I mean, who doesn't want economic and political stability? If you had been there and experienced the chaos, literally, of a lot of the periods of the 90s, I think everybody would be tired of it. Everybody would look for a more stable system than what they had. And so on the surface, these objectives are things that probably most countries share in common. You want to have positive economic growth. You want to have that type of stability. However, the approach that you take to get to that end goal, approaches can differ drastically. The positive aspects of the way Putin has approached this goal is, number one, that people genuinely have confidence in him. And even though there are, public opinion polls that suggest that confidence is dipping, when you're dipping from 80%, it's not really going to impact your ability to lead the country that much. And virtually all of the Russians that I talk to, the average Russians, when I'm in a taxi, on the bus, on the metro, wherever it may be, if you ask them what they think about President Putin, he's almost an unassailable character. And so the level of confidence that they have in him is extremely high. And they also genuinely feel that the government is much more stable and doing a better job than it was in the past. However, there is some validity to public opinion polling, and I read a recent poll a couple of months ago that also sums up the other side of what you hear from all of these taxi drivers and people riding the metro, and that is that Russians care much more about their economic stability than they care about democracy, which is important, because if you believe that you have to choose between one or the other, and you prefer economic stability, then it leaves the door open to allow democratic developments to simply slip by the wayside. And a lot of Russians do believe, from their experience with what they viewed as democracy in the 90s, they believe that you do have a choice, that for Russia, both democracy and economic stability cannot go hand in hand. And this is actually a historical trend in Russia. There was this concept in the 18th and 19th centuries of the Dobry Tsar, which is a benevolent dictator, if you might call him that. A lot of people talk about President Putin as somebody who prefers what you call a managed democracy. In other words, one where the government essentially tells everybody how to be democratic and how to be effective citizens, et cetera, and things like that. But the basic idea is that the general approach of Russians is to put someone powerful in place at the head of government and hope that they're going to do more good than bad over the course of time, and essentially place all of their trust that that person will take care of the country's needs. And the idea of actually participating actively in how the government makes decisions, how policy is developed, et cetera, is something that's somewhat of a foreign concept. In addition, even though the Russians have confidence in President Putin, it doesn't spread far beyond that. They have very little confidence in the majority of their other political leaders. Minister Fredkov, now who is the head of the government, is viewed very negatively by a large portion of the population. And most of the ministers, and on down from there, have low levels of confidence. And besides the low levels of confidence, in the US and in many other Western democracies, what preserves the delivery of basic human rights, basic civil rights, basic democratic rights to the citizens is not necessarily who's in power. Because if you look, for example, at your day-to-day life, between the point that President Clinton was in office and the point that President Bush was in office, and the next president, you will see that on a day-to-day level, not much changes. And the reason why is because in order for a democracy to function effectively, the political institutions that remain there regardless of who is in power are what deliver those rights to each one of us. And in Russia, unfortunately, those political institutions are weak, they lack public confidence, and they lack influence in the government. Now, looking forward a little bit as well, we have a new election that's coming up in 2008 in Russia. Maybe that looks a little bit too far into the future, but we are already seeing some developments that look like they are connected with positioning for the 2008 elections. And for Russia, especially because of the fact that there is no obvious heir apparent to President Putin, the question of who will become the next president, and will that president be able to sustain the economic growth and stability that has occurred over the last 5 years or so into the future, that is a big question for a lot of Russians. And so as you look at political maneuvering in Russia right now, it's not really about who will compete in free and fair elections, and it's more about determining who will be positioned as that heir apparent. In virtually uncontested elections with very few, if any, competitive political parties and most likely biased media reporting. And the stage, unfortunately, is being set for a lot of those things, and the discussions that are occurring right now are not about who is going to run for president, but whether or not President Putin is going to encourage for example, the changing of the Constitution so he could serve a third term, or whether or not he will do something similar to what President Yeltsin did, step down early, for example, or at least provide enough of his backing to a candidate that there's no chance for any other individual to be viable against them. In addition, politics in Russia right now, because of the fact that there is little connection between elected officials and their constituencies, it's much more about elite insider relationships. It's almost like insider trading in the stock market or something like that. It's not really about public dialogue. It's not really about, the competition of ideas. The constituencies that politicians are most anxious to serve and satisfy are not necessarily the people who put them into office, but it's the people above them. And in addition to simply this mentality, there's also there's some government structures that have been changed. For example, the appointment of governors in the 89 of Russia's regions by the executive branch. The Federation Council is now appointed by the administration, et cetera. And so because of all of this, it means that attention is deliberately focused upwards rather than downwards. And so rather than politicians reaching out to average citizens, they're reaching up to please the people who put them in power. I'll give you an example of this. We recently brought one of the state senators from Pennsylvania, Greg Vitale, and he came as a speaker to Russia to talk about the election process and how does somebody go from determining that they want to be a candidate for some particular office to getting into office and functioning. And he mentioned that during his campaigning, he knocked on over 5,000 doors of people, in his legislative district to try and drum up public support for his candidacy. And we, in this this particular session, we had some staffers from the Federal Duma, which is like our Congress. And afterwards, they came up and they said, "You knocked on 5,000 doors?" Their Duma member had knocked a single door, had never really had a town hall meeting or reached out through any way except for the standard media to connect with his constituency, which illustrates the fact that simply there's a very different approach to how you get into office. The other thing that this means is that the voice of the public isn't heard very often by policymakers. And so NGOs, civic groups, human rights organizations, alternative political parties, independent scholars and experts, et cetera, all of those people who want to be a part of the policy process are not really invited. And very often they're not allowed the right or the resources to have a voice and have their voice heard. And actually you see an almost deliberate insulation of policymakers from the public that makes it difficult for them to hear what the public wants. I mentioned as well the centralization. In addition to the 89 governors now being appointed and the Federation Council being appointed by the executive branch, what we also see is that the checks and balances between the three bodies of government, the legislative, the judicial, and the executive, don't really exist. Those two are so subordinate to the executive branch that essentially when President Putin or a member of his administration wants something to happen, they do. Let me give you a classic example of this. Recently, we started a new partnership program with Russia, an exchange program where we send volunteers each direction to do work on HIV/AIDS and providing internet and communication technologies to disabled people and underserved populations, and also to work on the preservation of historic cultural sites. And the U.S. government is providing some of the funding, and the expectation is that the Russian government will provide equal funding to match that. And we were sitting in a meeting with a member of the administration to discuss how was Russia going to fund their side of it. And we were amazed to hear that their idea was that they were going to go to a company, knock on their door, and tell them that they were going to fund it. And the question was, which company are we going to go knock on to tell them that they're going to fund this program from here on out? And unfortunately, you see that, while it's not widely publicized, you see that very often, that basically whatever the administration would like to have happen, in one way or another, it actually happens. Now, a lot of this centralization that we see happening came about in one way or another under the overall rubric of the fight against terrorism. And last year, shortly actually after we arrived, there were a few key events that happened that really kind of fomented public opinion in support of these administrative changes in the government. There were 2 airplane bombings that occurred over Russia on domestic Russian airlines within actually a couple of days of each other. In addition to that, there was a metro bombing. It was right outside the metro near the embassy. And about 10 or 11 days later, the incident at Beslan, which probably many of you are familiar with, when domestic terrorists took hold of a school and ended up killing about 300 children. And it was an absolutely gruesome, grisly event. My wife and I watched it on TV, and I mean, you just wanted to cry seeing what happened to these kids. It was absolutely horrible. And, the Russian public was outraged that these types of things would happen. It was, I would say, probably the closest thing that the Russians have had so far that would equate to what we experienced at 9/11, although it was more domestic forces rather than foreign ones. But as a result of this, what happened in Russia was the people basically said, okay, whatever needs to be done to deal with this problem, do it. In response to which, knowing that there was building public support, President Putin put into place many changes that had actually been under consideration for a long period. For example, the appointment of the 89 governors by the president. And what we see, if you look at a lot of the administrative reforms that are happening now, is that they're being done under this kind of common argument that they're critical for stability, for the fight against terrorism, et cetera, when in actuality, a lot of them don't have anything to do with political stability, with national security. They're simply being put kind of in the same package, and people perhaps aren't approaching them as critically as are necessary. And we like to use the analogy that this is like amputating your hand because you have a hangnail. It will get rid of the hangnail, I promise, but it gets rid of a lot more as well. And so the changes that Russians are now or are going to experience in the future in terms of their ability to participate in government, are quite drastic. Now, as you look at this whole focus on stability, on national security, and on control, let me just take a moment and comment on the Khodorkovsky and Yukos case, because it's one, obviously, that gets a lot of attention. It's gotten a lot of attention in the press here, and it gets a tremendous amount of attention in the press in Russia. And hopefully you'll be able to see how this kind of fits into the overall approach to control. First of all, Mikhail Khodorkovsky is not exactly a harmless lamb. He is an extremely powerful, very influential individual who acquired control of Yukos through a series of insider trading, illegal practices that are very similar to what the U.S. experienced in the early parts of the 20th century and in the 19th century. In other words, it's things that we would look at, if they happened here in the U.S., we would be absolutely outraged. And probably the best comparison that we could use is something like WorldCom or Enron, for example. The things that he did and various of his partners are questionable at best and unethical, illegal, and certainly possibly widely criminal, including, he has murder charges, et cetera, against him. The problem is that everybody else did exactly the same thing. In other words, all of the large businessmen, we call them oligarchs, they all got their businesses in exactly the same way that he got his. They all got it through insider trading. They all got it through connections to the Kremlin. And the choice that was made during the privatization process was to find some quick, relatively painless way to transfer property from government ownership to private ownership. And the best way that they could figure out to do it, given the constraints that they faced at the time, was to find people that they thought would do it somewhat effectively, profitably, economically, and then turn it all over to them for a small amount of what the company was worth. And so Mikhail Khodorkovsky bought his business for pennies on the dollar. Now, he was then arrested for tax evasion and a variety of other charges. If you had been able to see, I've just seen a couple of clips of when he was arrested. He was coming off a plane, and they had a SWAT team with AK-47s that came and got him. I mean, can you imagine if the head of Enron had been snatched from his house with men in bulletproof vests and AK-47s or M16s? I mean, it was obviously a PR show to show, the Kremlin flexing their muscles a little bit. And he was put in jail, and there were various concerns about the transparency of the trial, et cetera. But overall, nobody believes that he is innocent of all charges. I mean, we try to take a very cautious position to this in the U.S. because he's not a white dove, who hasn't done anything wrong. The problem here is not that we believe that all the charges against him are false. The problem, and this is the main complaint from the U.S. government and the main complaint from other Western governments, is that it's the targeted use of the judicial system in order to get at somebody that had political ambitions. And so not only did Khodorkovsky, first of all, decide that he was going to fund a large NGO called Open Russia, which does a lot of democracy and civil society work in supporting public groups, but he also had a big run-in with President Putin in 2003 at a meeting where President Putin called all the oligarchs together to kind of talk about how the government could work together with him. But he also openly talked about his candidacy for president in the 2008 elections, and possibly even earlier in the 2004 elections. So what we see here is we see that of this whole group of mild criminals who have acquired all of these large businesses, and now most of them are operating actually fairly transparently, only one of them, well, so far, has been targeted for tax evasion and the other charges. And so if this were applied as a blanket approach to everyone, we wouldn't have the same concerns. But what you see is that the administration uses the judicial system, legislation, etc., as a way to control the political arena. And Khodorkovsky thought that he could overcome this actually fairly large and powerful machine and bring in this uninvited outside influence into the policy process. And frankly, our belief is that that was the main reason why he was targeted. So, if you look at control, let me just address a couple of other quick areas. The first one is that the Russian government is unfortunately focused on a short-term fix, because if you look at government intervention overall as a way to solve societal or economic problems, they are never effective in the long term. This is the reason why the Soviet Union fell, is because government does not run business well. The mentalities are widely different between the way government operates and the way business operates. And so there are very few people who believe that this short-term solution to the chaos of the 90s that's coming now will actually be able to effectively govern in a more complex global environment when, you know, economic and other relationships are becoming much, much closer between countries. And so as the administration starts to deal with some of these reforms that they're trying to implement right now, and dealing with the fact that, for example, to achieve some of their goals, one of Putin's goals is to double GDP by 2010. In order to do those types of things, they are really coming more face-to-face now with the fact that they have to make some changes. A couple of examples. The small business environment, the number of small startup businesses in Russia is surprisingly low, even though Russians in general are quite enterprising and they're quite creative in the way that they earn money. You also find some problems like there's a stagnation in the high-tech arena. For example, you may be familiar with the fact that one of the main founders of Google is a Russian, and he emigrated here I think about 15 years ago. And, you know, Russian programmers, for example, engineers, scientists, they're some of the most brilliant in the world. But unfortunately, the environment doesn't support the utilization of their skills. Because of the stagnation in the high-tech sectors, et cetera, there's still no Microsoft, no Google, no Oracle, no Cisco, no really viable manufacturing, for example. They have issues with the respect of intellectual property rights, you know, and there are a host of other concerns, for example, in connection with accession to the World Trade Organization, et cetera. So what we're seeing now is that this environment of control is starting to see some holes poke through. And hopefully these holes will become large enough that the administration will decide before some type of economic crisis occurs to make some of these necessary changes. But unfortunately, if you look at kind of the basic concepts of the way a system functions, in order to make drastic changes, usually there has to be a break in the system, which occurred, for example, in the 90s when the ruble crashed in 98 and 99. That caused Russians to drastically rethink the way their economy was functioning and led to some more open market reforms in the economic system. We're hopeful that it won't require this type of a crisis to have similar changes in the political arena that we hope would occur. So now as we talk, let me turn for a moment to foreign policy, and then we'll take some time for some questions. First of all, the tenor of conversations between high-level Russian and American officials now is very different from, for example, the way it was during the Soviet Union. I wasn't there, obviously, for those meetings in the Soviet times, but everybody talks about the difference that you feel. And so as I share some of these challenges in the political arena, I don't mean to say that our relations are in a shambles, or to say that Russia, you know, lacks hope, or that they're, you know, going entirely down the wrong path, because there are some very positive developments in our relations. We have partnerships in areas that we never would have dreamed of before, you know, 1988, for example. We work together on fighting terrorism, on non-proliferation issues, preventing the spread of HIV, AIDS, and other infectious diseases. We have all kinds of programs that we work on together on a very tactical level that suggests that we really have more of a partnership than sometimes it might seem, given the fact that we do have very different political approaches. Not only that, but we're also working together in various former Soviet countries. And if you look at what happened most recently in Kyrgyzstan, you can see that the U.S. and Russia were much more aligned in the way we approached the situation than, for example, what happened in Georgia or Ukraine. We worked together on the NATO-Russia Council. Russia is a member of the Partnership for Peace program with NATO, which gives it maybe even more impetus to form constructive relations with Western countries. Russia is looking to join the World Trade Organization, and we strongly support their accession. Even though we believe that there are some changes that need to occur, we're working with Russia to try and implement some of those changes so that they can be ready for WTO accession. We're working together on projects, for example, a gas line to the Sakhalin Islands, which are all the way on the Pacific side of Russia. And Russia has some vast natural resources, natural gas, oil, etc. We're predicting that by 2007, California may already be using natural gas and oil from the Sakhalin Islands. And so we do have a large number of tactical partnerships that we can point to and say, here's where we have some success. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, in order for us to have a relationship that goes beyond policy disagreements and weathers those storms of different approaches, we need to have more than just those tactical programs to work with. And so we need to transcend, these fundamental programs to get to more of a values-based partnership. President Bush, after his meeting with President Putin in Bratislava, said the following about our approach to Russia and how we believe our partnership can be formed. He said, "It's in my country's interest that Russia be a strong and viable partner with the United States. It's very important that we establish not only a working relationship, but that we understand that in the 21st century, strong countries are built by developing strong democracies. Democracies always reflect a country's customs and culture, but democracies always have certain things in common. They have rule of law, protection of minorities, a free press, viable political opposition, etc." So one of the key things that we feel is going to be critical if our partnership with Russia is to deepen is that we have some opportunity to work together with Russia in developing their democracy. And Russia believes that they are a kind of a democracy in embryo. And if you compare them, for example, to most post-Soviet countries, they're probably one of the most democratic in that region, at least. And they're certainly the most influential. The problem that we see in using this as the basis for our future partnership is that Russia views U.S. efforts to promote democracy not only in Russia but also in other former Soviet countries as a way of undermining Russia and weakening their power, their influence in the region. It has to do in part with the historical aspects of their relations with these other countries. For example, in my office, we have a team of Americans and a team of Russians that work with us. And most of them believe that the flight to Kiev is actually a domestic flight, and that Ukraine is more a republic or a region than it is a sovereign country. And unfortunately, this holds true for most of the other former Soviet countries as well, is that they believe that they're really kind of part of Russia, or they at least should be a part of Russia because they were a part of the Soviet Union. And so as we look at our cooperation, even though we have this kind of tactical work that we do, we don't have agreement on how we should approach problems, for example, such as what should our role, the role of each the United States and Russia be in these former Soviet countries? Or how exactly should we interpret the events in Chechnya? Or how should we deal with transnational issues such as human trafficking or drug trafficking or disease or the demographic trends of labor, etc. And so Russia tends to see our activity with them in the sphere of democracy through this lens of old political mindset. Because really our relations with Russia in the past were based on containment. We wanted to stop Russia from expanding, stop the Soviet Union from expanding, and we wanted to weaken any countries that were aligned with Russia. Now our approach is very different. Now we'd rather have a strong partnership with Russia. We'd rather see Russia strong. But Russia doesn't believe that that's really what we want. And so what's the answer? What's the answer to how we deal with Russia over the next 5 or 10 years? There are two things. The first one is that engagement with Russia is critical. There is no way that we can do less than what we're doing right now. We have to keep doing at least as much and probably more. And engagement means that we always have to have a constructive approach and try and find, those points at which we can find enough agreement to work together. And then use those, get a critical mass of those points of agreement that over time will lead us to more philosophical or values-based partnership. There's no way that, given Russia's geopolitical position and their importance to things that we consider part of our national security, like fighting terrorism, that we can afford to have any less of a partnership with Russia than we have right now. We also need to recognize that Russia is still developing as a democratic state, and that they are in transition, and that very often it takes a long time for democracies really to develop and thrive. We also need to recognize that Russia will only be successful in the long term if Russians are the ones contributing to their democratic and political development. And so the support, for example, for civil society groups, NGOs, you may have heard that most recently President Putin indicated that they will not tolerate the foreign financing of any groups that have any type of political activity. This was just actually a few days before we came here from Russia. This is a concern because we believe that Russian civil society will have the most influence in helping Russia actually develop democratically. So, those are areas that we're continuing to work. And so let me sum up with the 4 key things that I think, and then we'll open this up for questions. The 4 key areas that will frame our partnership for the future and what the chances for a deep U.S.-Russia partnership will be. Number 1, relations with Russia's neighbors. This is a very touchy issue there, as I mentioned, and it's something that based on how successful we are in negotiating that issue with Russia, I think it will determine to a large degree the amount to which Russia is willing to work with us. Number 2, obviously, combating non-proliferation or combating proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear and other material. It's so important for us to make sure that Russia, who has the second largest number of nuclear material and weapons in the world, guard them sufficiently so that they don't fall into the wrong hands. Number 3, the bilateral economic relationship, finding ways to partner to a greater degree, specifically in the energy arena. And number 4, as I mentioned, helping Russia transform in their democratic and political directions. Let me just share with you a couple of quick quotes to close. The first one is that President Bush indicated that with our focus on democracy, we have to make sure that we balance a principled stand with making concrete progress or finding specific ways to help. Condoleezza Rice said the deepening of U.S.-Russian relations can only take place on the basis of a multi-layered relationship based not only on common interests but on common commitments to things for which we are both willing to make sacrifices. So what we see, I think, in the future with those 4 issues is, number 1, we have to make sure that we are constructively engaging Russia, keeping the conduit of communication open, developing people-to-people exchange relationships, business-to-business relationships, and getting those various layers in place. And number 2, that we have to recognize that Russia's democracy may not look exactly like ours. They may choose to take a slightly different path, and we have to determine for ourselves, what do we feel is really critical for Russia? And in what areas is there flexibility for them to take a different path than the path, for example, that we've taken? And so I think hopefully as we balance those types of things and understand the historical context of where Russia is right now, and what we hope will be enough positive motivation to get Russia to an open and democratic society, that we will be able to play a key role, because partnership between the United States and Russia has not only importance for us and them, but it also has the capacity and the potential to bring great benefit to the rest of the world as well. So, now that I've kind of said that, I know we're basically out of time here. I'm open to any questions that you have. I know that a lot of you will need to leave, but I want to see if I can answer any questions that you've got.
You mentioned Russia's efforts to become part of the World Trade Organization. You've mentioned business ties between Russia and the U.S. Is Russia, in your opinion, making any real progress toward combating illegal distribution of intellectual property and counterfeit consumer goods?
Well, if you ask Russia, they're making great progress in fighting IPR-related problems. What we see, if you look at the numbers, you see a huge upswing in the last about 4 years of the percentage of pirated software, DVDs, CDs, et cetera, that are on the market. And when we go shopping, there are various markets that sell, kind of souvenir items, tourist items, et cetera. You also can buy a lot of DVDs for about $1 or $2 there as well. And they have a nice little license on them that says this is authentic, this is a licensed product, et cetera. Of course, where they bought that, to stick that little sticker on there is probably unknown at this point. So looking at it from the perspective of an observer, I actually sit on the IPR task force at the embassy, we see that Russia is interested and willing at least the highest levels to do something, but that there's not really a whole lot of concrete progress at this point. And this is one of the issues actually that is being debated in Congress and the Senate right now, whether or not the U.S. should take a stand in blocking Russia's accession to the WTO until they make some concrete progress. Here's where we see the problem. The problem is that if you look at the disposable income of the average Russian, paying $15 for a CD or $20 for a DVD is way out of their capability. They just can't afford it. And most Russian legislators, most Russian judges, most Russian policemen, they understand that because a lot of them are in the same situation. And so they view IPR violations as this kind of benign crime that really doesn't hurt anybody. And so even though the legislation that exists relative to IPR is actually pretty good, we helped them draft a lot of the legislation, still the implementation is a big problem because most judges don't convict. They will slap a very small fine. They don't confiscate the goods. They don't confiscate the equipment. And the people just go back. And they view the fines that they get as just kind of part of the price of doing business. So even though there's support at a policy level, we're not seeing an implementation at this point. Yes? Actually, before you mention that, let me just say one thing. However, we do not support blocking Russia from being a part of the WTO. We support working with Russia to help them deal with the problem and then their accession to WTO. So it's important that, from our perspective, that's kind of the recommendations that we provide. Sorry.
Are there any hopes of Russia opening up their borders like a lot of the European countries, as in allowing people to come and visit Russia without, extensive sort of bureaucratic nonsense,
You sound like you've gotten a Russian visa before.
I have, and I feel I got robbed by the government before I got pickpocketed on the streets of Moscow. So it's very expensive to get a visa, especially as a tourist, and it is very complicated process.
It is a complicated process. We actually just helped some friends of ours come from South Africa to Russia, and if you heard them talk about their experience, they were extremely frustrated. First of all, actually that's mostly a Russian affair, so I don't have really any expertise on what Russia is thinking about their visa processes, et cetera. But I will say a couple of things. First of all, Russia would love for the U.S. to have an open visa regime for them, or a visa-free policy towards them. And if we were to say, yes, we will allow you, no visa access to the U.S., I'm sure that they would be willing to do the same thing for us. And a lot of the visa questions are based on reciprocity. So, for example, if we charge them $100 to get a U.S. visa, they're going to charge us $100 to get a Russian visa. If we say it's going to take 3 weeks to get a U.S. visa, they're going to say it takes 3 weeks to get a Russian visa. And for most countries, there is a certain aspect of reciprocity that's a part of it. However, Russia faces too many issues right now, I think, to be able to consider that. And my guess would be that if the question was even raised in kind of the consular policy crowd in Russia, that everybody would say it's very unrealistic at this point because Russia faces too many threats. And they would like an open visa regime with the European Union as well. And in fact, a lot of them feel a little bit discriminated against by Europe because they don't have that privilege. But I think if you look at it, even reasonably objectively, it's probably not likely that it'll happen in the near future until some of the internal issues get resolved. Such as the fact that, Chechen terrorists or other terrorists can so easily gain access to a plane in Russia or to the metro or to all other forms of transportation. It means that threat could even more easily, get into Russia or get out of Russia if the borders were more open than they are right now. Okay. If my wife is here as well, if anybody has a question about what it's like to be a family member of a foreign service officer, what it's like to live in Russia for somebody maybe who's not involved as much with work, please feel free to ask whatever. Yes?
I actually have a question about the political parties. You talk about how politics seems to me, from listening to you and from reading, that it's a high-level game. I mean, it's the individuals. So are the political parties somewhat artificial, created from above? Or are there actually opposition political parties that are allowed to exist and try to get candidates and people join and that sort of thing?
There are two parties that are probably the most viable opposition parties right now. They're called SPS, or the Union of Right Forces, and Yabloko. Putin's party is called Единая Россия, which is United Russia. And that was one that was created much more from kind of the top down. The other two were actually developed as genuine opposition parties. And there are some efforts now to kind of unite some of these more liberal, more democratic-oriented parties to form a more united opposition bloc to United Russia. But just to give you a quick snapshot, about 80% of the Duma seats right now are held by United Russia. So whether or not you consider these other parties as viable opposition or not, it's kind of a moot point. If 80% are held by one party, there's not really much that you can do. There's also legislation that's been introduced recently that makes it more difficult for a party to register, let alone actually actively develop the constituency that would be necessary for them to do anything. Because the fact that a party's registered doesn't necessarily mean that they can accomplish anything. And that's one of our other concerns, is that it seems like the stage is being set for less political competition, fewer political parties, and more centralized control in Единая Россия, or United Russia. And again, it's a combination of the fact that Putin has such strong support, legislation that's in place, the inability of the more democratic opposition parties to agree on how they should approach developing a common opposition platform, etc. But so is it really likely that we're going to get a strong party that will come into play, for example, by 2008? Probably not. Well, look at the results they're getting. I mean, how do you tell a country that has 7.1% GDP growth that they're doing something wrong? It's hard. And so the people are very pleased with the way the economy is going, and unfortunately that's the main factor at this point. Okay,
Hi. I wonder if you could give us an idea of what your daily routine is as a public diplomacy officer in Moscow, and also if I could extend the question to your wife, what your daily life in Russia is like. I know that's a broad question, but...
Well, okay, and I know that probably we're over time. If anybody needs to go, please do. Daily life as a foreign service officer. Well, first of all, the Moscow embassy is a little bit unique. Besides Baghdad, it's the largest embassy in the world, and because you combine that with the fact that Russia is arguably one of the most important binational or bilateral partners that we have. Means that working in the embassy in Moscow is actually really, really interesting. On a daily basis, besides my standard portfolio, which is mostly working with think tanks and research institutions, et cetera, we do a lot of other things. We have a lot of other visitors that come through. We have events that we set up. We have I do some speech writing for the ambassador. And so on a daily basis, I would say I probably have meetings for a third of my day. I have about an hour or so to think about kind of more strategic planning. What are some of the key issues that we want to make sure get raised in the near future with some of the experts that we're dealing with? We do a lot of programming and program administration because I'm responsible for about $10 million worth of exchange programs. We do a lot of oversight to make sure that, you know, people are getting their visas and they're getting their tickets, and we've selected the right people for these programs, et cetera. So that's probably another, you know, 2 or 3 hours a day that's spent on that. And then actually I do quite a bit of reading as well, because I'm responsible for working with the policy analysis community. I have to try and, you know, kind of keep up with what's being said and what types of things might be of interest to them and how to engage them. And so I follow the press, the Russian press, the US press, and some of the other international press actually quite closely as well. Russia is very interesting. I should let my wife make a couple of comments, because living in Russia is both fascinating and interesting and a little bit stressful, at least living in Moscow, because traffic is horrible. The weather in the winter is dismal. You can buy all the food that you want, and it's actually very good, but actually getting to where you need to be to buy the food takes forever. So there's certain aspects of actually daily life that are challenging, but maybe I'll let you make a couple
I think
comments.
it depends on if you have kids or not. And if you go as a diplomat, you are very well taken care of. And we have a child, and so we're at a very nice housing, you know, development, and so we have lots of friends, and, you know, so I don't leave home unless I really have to, which is terrible to say, you know, so when we have guests and things we leave, but the prospect of, you know, 20 minutes to the embassy one day and 3 hours the next day and never knowing, like, traffic is just not predictable at all. Anytime, I mean, it's not like you don't leave your house at 3 o'clock because there's, you know, a traffic jam. It's any time during the day. Then I stay home when we can, and we go shopping on Saturdays, and, you know, there's lots of things to do in our little community. You know, if you go single, if you don't have children, you're in the middle of the city, Moscow, there is always something to do, and it's fun. You know, I mean, there's theater and there's music, all kinds of music, and, you know, Moscow is a very historic place to be. So I think Russia is a very enigmatic kind of country where there's lots of things you can learn and be involved in. You just have to, we just kind of take it in stride. We don't always go, you know, every day, or, you know, we kind of have to schedule it out. But Moscow, I think, is different than other Russian places as well. Our Russian friends tell us that there's 3 people in Russia. There's the Russians, the foreigners, and the Muscovites. And, you know, just recently before we came, we went to St. Petersburg, and it's a totally, totally different feeling. So my days, the better question to ask me is, what's it like to be a mom than what's it like to be in Russia? So.
Just maybe one last thing on there. You know, being in the Foreign Service is the main benefit that you get from it, I think, is the chance to experience firsthand what a different culture is like. And it's very different than just going there, for example, on vacation, because you experience not only the bright, shining tourist locations, et cetera, but you also get a chance to get connected with the concerns of average, everyday Russians, or average, everyday, you know, wherever it happens to be that you live. And so the rewarding part of it is the fact that you get to really learn, what do people think about? What do they talk about around the kitchen table? You know, what are they concerned about? And then to try and figure out whether or not there's something that you can influence your government or your embassy or your community to do, especially relative to the problems that they're facing. And so, you know, the Foreign Service is interesting because you get a lot of cultural opportunities, you get a lot of chances to see things that other people read about in, you know, National Geographic and Time Magazine, et cetera, but most importantly because it changes your perspective on the world. And it gives you insights into the fact that there are people who live every day in a one-bedroom apartment, you know, with 2 or 3 families in there, who faced, you know, very difficult economic situations, or who are facing them now, and who are going through a transitional democracy. And to start to recognize, you know, what that means for them gives you a different perspective on your own life as well. And so, as I look back on what we see as the key benefit to a Foreign Service lifestyle, it's what it does for you, and what it does for your family, and what it does for your kids eventually, and the perspective that they get on life. So.